Hello, friends and followers. Today is Friday, the 21st of March, and spring is here. We've had some lovely weather in England. Today is a little bit overcast, but still not bad, warm. So spring is here. Let's see. Okay, I was going to do this channel. I'm trying to do at least one video a week on geopolitics, geopolitics, which is something that interests me very much. Then another one on, I would say, general things like culture, and that could be history, a little bit of history or literature or something like that. And I'm trying to leave another one for sundry items, whatever comes up. I'm trying to see if I can interview some people I would very much like to interview. And anyway, so I was going to do one on politics today because I said, okay, I have to organize myself. And let's say sundry items on Monday, geopolitics on Wednesday, cultural things on Friday, but it doesn't quite work that way. Because today I was going to do the geopolitics, one on geopolitics, or politics in general. And I decided that I shouldn't do it because the answer to all the questions I was posing myself about what is going on, how we are viewing conflicts, the current conflicts going on in the world and so on. It's rather, I don't understand it. It seems to be contradictory stance. I think I have to wait a little bit more to see how things develop a little bit in order to get an idea of at least the right questions to ask myself. At the moment, all I can say is I don't know. And since I don't know, I'm not going to talk about it. So I'm going to do something on literature, well, actually on culture, yes. Okay, and I got a little book here that I found rather amusing, and it's about talks given by Alistair Cooke. You remember Alistair Cooke? It's entitled "The Patient Has the Flaw." Alistair Cooke was an Englishman born at the beginning of the century. He lived in America since the 1930s, forever, and he was a journalist for the most part. And he was very famous because he had this radio program at the beginning, Letter from America. I don't know whether some of you remember it. Anyway, he was a very accomplished writer and speaker, and he gave talks all over. The last, he was still alive in the 1980s. One of them that I have here is from the 1980s. Most of them are from after the war to, from after the war to the 80s. And this one in the some of those talks that he gave to corporations, he talked to the medical academies, the lawyers, everybody. He was always giving talks, and this one they put them all together. Okay, some of them, a series of essays here, and he starts the book by saying a note on speech making. And he says, listening to speeches is something, is sometimes a duty which very many intelligent people rightly dread or at best put up with, as they put up with Christmas shopping or going to funerals. As one who spent 30 years or more covering political rallies, I share the general dread. But as a practicing word man, learning throughout half a century to write for listeners as well as readers, that's an interesting point. Writing for listeners, one way. Writing for readers, another way. So, as a practicing wordman, learning throughout half a century to write for listeners as well as readers, I came to wonder why so few public speakers appear to have stopped to consider the peculiar fun and challenge of a face-to-face appeal to the humanity of a captive audience. Maybe there is a built-in tribal suspicion of the very act of speech-making, possibly going back to a child's healthy distaste for sermons, 2 of which I had to endure every Sunday, or tedious afternoons memorizing, in his day, such orations as Antony's over Caesar's corpse, no longer that. The main lesson that came through being the showiness and hypocrisy of speech fires. Yet, speech-making is an art form, just as the novel, the sonnet, the essay, the broadcast are art forms, all worth a lot of attention and scarce practice. When Shaw, the writer, whose slightly querulous doubling voice and chop-chop delivery made him a rather poor public speaker at the start, was asked how he later learned to develop a pungent speaking style, he said, "You learn to speak in public exactly as you learn to ride a bicycle. You keep falling off." Before the invention of the microphone, it was necessary to learn, as singers learn, to project from the diaphragm, and the unnatural effort of this must have had much to do with the ponderousness of the overblown emotionalism of what was being said. In all the years that I have stalked politicians, I can think of only 6 who I felt had perfectly acquired the knack of accommodating the gift of the gab to a particular audience. Lloyd George, my goodness, beginning of 20th century, Lloyd George was the first, at a time when speech had to be audible to a large audience in an auditorium or a public square, or to the small but formal audience of the House of Commons. He was a master of the required projected style, who knew how to float dirigibles of real or artificial indignation, and light them up with flashes of wit and sarcasm. It was remarkable that his speeches often read poorly in print. The same could not be said of Churchill, who had only one, a majestic style of rolling Gibbonesque cadences punctuated by short, sharp Anglo-Saxon idioms that he used as much for a breakfast monologue as for a heart-rending appeal to the American people to give us the guns and we'll finish the job. In him, before an audience of 6 million, it was the timing of the vernacular punch and the porky humor that kept people alert, who were otherwise unimpressed by the rumbling procession of Latinisms. Hitler I heard before he himself, before a small outdoor crowd in Munich, at a time in 1931, when he was still regarded by the rest of Germany as an eccentric radical or a failed rabble-rouser. To attract an audience of 100 or so, he had the staff at the Braunhaus shut their desks and whip outside to form a big, large group of people, a clack. Even a small ambulance standing by seemed another unnecessary come on. But at the end of the 20-minute speech, I heard 2 or 3 women had fainted, for the good neurological reason that he could hypnotize even a small audience with omens of a dire future. He did this not with the hysterical bawling which was all we saw in the newsreels before and throughout the Second World War, but with a style of the most artful variation of mood, from tenderness to whimsy to outrage. He convinced me, for one, that he had had it. Franklin Roosevelt overlapped the 2 eras of the soaring public speech and the microphone talk. And unlike the hundreds of politicians who loved him or loathed him, he learned wholly different techniques for the massed crowd at the Capitol and the family settled before a loudspeaker. Ronald Reagan learned, in brackets, how slow and painfully can be gathered from seeing his films, that the microphone is a speaker's best friend, to be charmed, solaced, moved by an quiet, natural speaking style, so that all his speeches, however inflamed with emotion, sound the way he might sound if he were tearful or cheerful across the small room. By contrast, few politicians even today appear to trust to the invention of electricity, and consequently sound as if they were addressing a PTA meeting or a rally in Wembley Stadium. The last and not the least memorable of this sextet is the late Senator George Aiken of Vermont, a dry, wry, hilarious after-dinner speaker whose relative ineffectiveness in the Senate must have been due to his conviction that audiences of any size, indoor or out, were in fact a small bunch of cronies sipping their coffee. My own case can be simply stated. If the microphone had not become a standard adjunct of ballrooms and auditoriums, there would have been few speeches and no book. Since a radio engineer once told me that I had a pair of... The reason being, since a radio engineer... Backed punctuation here, editors. Since a radio engineer once told me that I had a pair of lungs of the lowest decibel volume he had ever monitored. Towards the end of the Second World War, I was attached for a spell to the U.S. Air Transport Command as a correspondent lecturer, and had a humbling baptism before pilots, navigators, mechanics, and other grease monkeys crowded into gymnasiums, or out on the tarmac in most of the ATC's American bases from Detroit to Brownsville, Texas, to Great Falls, Montana. These show-me skeptics were not there to be harangued about the beauty of Anglo-American friendship or the holy Christian mission of the Allies. They wanted as much entertaining sense as possible to be packed into the fewest possible words. It was an early good reminder that your audience is just as sharp and sensitive as you are. On these talkative safaris, I learned too that the microphone enables a speaker to talk to an audience of 2,000 with the same ease of emphasis and timing he would use before an audience of 2. For about 20 years after the war, I was on the lecture circuit and spoke ad lib before every sort of audience in most states of the Union. Then in 1965 came the invitation from the Mayo Clinic. It was followed by other invitations from other distinguished medical bodies. By the time the House of Representatives got around to requesting a celebration of its 200 years of boisterous health, I had gone off the platform, but resolved thereafter to accept only invitations from learned bodies about whose specialty we laymen on the outside have firm and quirky convictions they may be unaware of. So that what this book is about is this: the layman talking before the College of Cardinals, which is me, he says, a chore for which, as I explain in the title lecture, the journalist ought to be particularly well qualified. At any rate, I felt the time had come to say where I stood on some of the issues that spark our prejudices and engage our lives, and about which, since nobody is going to elect us to the Senate or compel us to testify before a congressional committee, most of us can afford to be cheerfully dogmatic or offhand in the social banter of friendship. Several friends urged me to include a lecture I did in Brussels in 1983 before an audience of NATO and other Western ambassadors and their military attachés. It came down in the end to attempting to say how we could melt the frozen conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. I found that I could not and still cannot say what should be done about the nuclear buildup, arms control and the rest of it, except to plead for a fresh start in which both nations would sit down and trust each other. Since we do not trust each other, I, like some very eminent persons I may say, was simply announcing the problem rather than solving it. So that speech had nothing new to offer and was quietly discarded. All these lectures, the ones in the book, except one, were reprinted in the appropriate journals, together with footnotes indicating sources which professionals could readily track down, but which, I believe, would only distract the general reader. The exception was the keynote lecture I gave in San Francisco to the assembly of double-dome British and American scholars looking into the state of the language. My mock-modest suspicion that my contribution was so humble that it may affront many people here was well-founded. The 60 following lectures appeared in a book carrying the title of the conference, but not mine. The pain of this slight was greatly relieved by congratulatory notes from Graham Greene and Philip Larkin. Okay, so he continues a little bit, but the one that carries the title, "The Patient Has the Floor," was given before the annual convocation of the Mayo Graduate School of Medicine, Rochester, Minnesota, on the 28th of May, 1965, and is this: "The patient has the floor. I'm sure that Dr. Johnson, not Dr. Johnson, your Dr. Johnson, gave me an unintended opening when he wrote to invite me to be your speaker, and added, 'You may discuss any topic of your choice.' Although all of us in Rochester who are involved in this program are primarily in some branch of medicine, we do not nevertheless necessarily expect an address related to medicine. Any topic of broad general interest would be suitable." This is, I imagine, the usual courtesy offered to pacify the fears of some statesman, lawyer, or other grandee who never appears before a doctor except to have his chest tapped, his knees jerked, his tongue depressed, his innards photographed, his rectum protoscoped, and all his juices filtered, measured, and pronounced upon. It is, though you may not know it, a permanently humiliating relationship. He's talking to doctors. This is a permanently humiliating relationship. I mean the relationship between doctors and the rest of mankind. And it is because most people do not care to bring it up in public that I believe it might be useful for me to do so. In fact, I think it is my duty as a journalist to speak for the patients, to you. A journalist has always been the social link between the expert and the layman. Wonderful. A journalist is supposed to be the link between the expert and the layman, between the public and the private man. At his worst, he can become the publisher's disciple, the politician's yes man, the tycoon's sycophant, the actor's press agent. At his worst. But at his best, he reports the world not as it ought to be, but as his eyes and ears tell him it is. Because our only relation with our doctor occurs when we need him badly, we must all, for our self-respect, adopt in a mild form the delusion which every young mother hugs to her person, the belief that her obstetrician is the only man who has ever safely delivered a baby. So I speak up for the patient, because the patient, when you see him, is usually too terrified to speak up for himself. I mean, too terrified to speak about doctors. The raw material rarely answers back, which is what makes laboratory research so satisfying. But if the Mediterranean fruit fly could talk, it would doubtless acquaint the farmer with some of his misapprehensions. The dolphin, whose whistles and grunts constitute a pretty sophisticated language, is already beginning to make us look silly. It is just possible that the layman, the patient, tottering wide-eyed into this strange jungle of viruses and cultures and men in white, may see a few simple things which you doctors do not see. May I give you an instance, which happened the only other time that I dared to appear, so to speak, as a lay preacher before the College of Cardinals. A few years ago, I was invited to Boston to speak at the annual dinner of the Massachusetts Heart Fund. I was expected, as I understood it, to launch the drive and supply, if possible, a slogan. When I arrived, I found, to my embarrassed astonishment, that all my dinner companions were eminent heart specialists, including Dr. Paul Dudley White, who, you may recall, preserved General Eisenhower. My qualifications for addressing a distinguished body of heart surgeons and provers were hardly less pathetic than they are for facing you today, although my two closest friends at Yale were medical students who are now a surgeon and a psychiatrist of alarming distinction, whom I would still not trust to lance a boil or wipe a tear. I began to try and justify my being there by noting that a foreign correspondent is a man whose very employment requires him to keep up the bluff that he takes all knowledge for his province. So I shuffled in front of the doctors samples of their own jargon. I don't suppose I fooled any of the formidable men present with my jargon. But even the most disinterested specialist in any country takes on the prejudices of his own land. and my own peculiar history, that of an Englishman born and bred, and an American tamed and naturalized, had forced me by accident into a peculiar speciality of my own, which is the continuous observation of what is British about Britain and American about America. So, facing these tolerant, though solemn, medical men, I took the risk of recalling that the United States is at all times a country with a passion for fashion, by which I don't mean it has a fetish for women's clothes, which country does not. I mean its ears are alertly tuned for the last cry in every kind of process, the latest trick in bookbinding or tree planting or bridge building or teaching piano, in bathroom gadgets, in theories of education, in cocktails, sex, architecture, in ideas. All I could offer the doctors was the reminder that this trait extends also to the learned practice of medicine. For I recalled how, in the 1930s, every rash or sneeze was attributed to an allergy, and a roaring business was done by manufacturers of flockless pillows and proprietors of Canadian resorts above the ragweed line. And so it went, down to that memorable evening before the heart specialists, which I dwell on because it explains why I am here, and some of its lessons may apply to us. At that time, the word cholesterol, gibbered through the land as the word unclean used to herald the approach of a leper. There was a tremendous to-do about the lethal snags created in the bloodstream by carbohydrates and animal fats, either separately or in combination. 4 or 5 years ago, it was established, at least to the satisfaction of a panicky populace and the makers of anticoagulant pills, that cholesterol was as fatal as silt along a riverbed, and was responsible for most of the seizures and strokes of what are called successful men. That is, men who decide to take a first trip around the world and then keel over at their desks. I gather that this precious discovery is now not only in doubt, but is looked on by some specialists as a naive superstition, a hangover from the dark ages of medicine, namely the 1950s. The rush to consume only soybean and vegetable fats was declared to be premature. But carbohydrates are now more suspect than ever, so there is a national retreat from pastries and a grateful stampede back to beef, and lately a learned pamphlet advises us back to alcohol. All I could say to this medical gathering was that if the cholesterol theory was true, and if animal fats and carbohydrates were certain prescriptions for heart attacks, then they would have to explain to me the miracle whereby 55 million Britons were still alive. For all known civilized communities, the British are the connoisseurs of animal fats and the compulsive addicts of carbohydrates, with their morning toast and eggs bubbling in bacon fat, their biscuits at 11 o'clock, their lunch of meat and potatoes and worse suet, then tea and more biscuits and cake, and dinner with meat and bread again, and potatoes and pudding, and perhaps an emergency snack of cheese and biscuits to guarantee coming safely through the night. How to explain the endurance, the ignorant but cheerful survival of the British? I saw that the doctors were now tense and puzzled, which is always a sign that you have a specialist by the tail. I was bold enough to offer an answer. Britain, I had noticed, maintains rights of way across fields and meadows and builds footpaths alongside highways and uses the phrase, "let's go for a walk," almost as an idiom. In America, you cannot walk across fields except in pursuit of a ball with a liquid center, and there are no footpaths once the town ends. The British walk and cycle and walk, even in the rain. Let us face it, gentlemen, I said, they function. Could it be, I wondered, like Harvey groping towards the theory of the circulation of the blood, could it be that lumps of cholesterol could be shaken loose from the walls of the arteries by a lively bloodstream as rocks and weeds are carried away by a river in flood? Perhaps the secret of avoiding blood clots lay in the humble admonition of the London bobby. Keep moving. After this barefaced performance, I sat down in some embarrassment until Dr. White told me that I had spoken words of the profoundest wisdom and that he wished the slogan, "Keep moving," might be taken over and plastered on billboards throughout the United States. I told him it was not copyright, but the trick would be to get the American population to learn, as a novelty, the very old process of walking to work or simply upstairs. The vainglory of this occasion came back to me when you flattered me with the invitation to be here today. I don't expect, and you shouldn't, any similar moments of clairvoyance. But sometimes the patient who doesn't know what ails him can help the doctor find out by merely reciting his gripes and grievances. I have two, and they are the minor and the major themes of this talk. The first is the subtle tyranny of fashion, even in the sciences, even in medicine. I have already suggested that it is worth any doctor's while to pause from time to time and ask himself whether he is really pursuing a new and fruitful line or whether he is running with the herd, whether he's falling back on a well-worn conviction or whether he's falling back on a national prejudice or even the prejudice of the school he was trained in. Edward Rist, in his essay What is Medicine, noticed that in every country our colleagues have their phantoms and their ghosts. For the Englishman it is uric acid, for the German the exudative diathesis, for the American focal infection. It is simpler even than that. I have noticed in knocking around the world and getting the same the traveller's complaint in several countries, that doctors, however circumspect, tend to take on the folk prejudices or habits of their country. Thus, in France, every stomach upset is at once attributed to a malfunction in that old liver, which all Frenchmen alike regard as the most vulnerable of all human organs. They consequently soothe the stomach with bowls of vegetable soup and a glass of wine 3 times a day. In Germany, they administer first a black draught, and then, having tapped the belly with a wooden hammer to see if it gives off a tremulous hollow echo, they put you on black bread, chicken broth, and charcoal. In England, they instantly prescribed a bland, not to wander around in search of a finer word, a bland diet of tea, black mange, and bread soaked in hot milk. In Scotland, I am glad to say, even eminent gastroenterologists order up a soothing draught of milk and whiskey, the milk, a rather toxic fluid, being cut down and cut off as the patient improves. In America, the patient is abandoned at once to bouillon and jelly and to ice water, to which, by the way, the British ascribe all American afflictions from peptic ulcer and coronary thrombosis to shortness of breath, sinusitis, and the existence of the Republican Party. Now, let us go to the main theme, which is about the dangers and the dullness of professional jargon. The use you make of the language that we, the doctors and the patients, have in common. What I want to do this evening is to make a plea to you as professionals whose main business is to restore men and women to their normal place in society, that is to say, whose professional aim is, as old Adolf Mayo said about psychiatrists, to bow out of the lives of your patients as soon as possible. I want to ask you to come halfway to the patient and society in explaining to him health and disease. In other words, this is to be a little lecture on jargon, offered to a profession that is more prone to it than most. Why this should be so, I have been unable to work out. In my boyhood, the most practical aim of learning Latin was to help you employ as little Latin as possible in the use of English. If you know the roots of a word like circumlocution, it is then easy to see that the English word is roundabout. A few years ago, I had a lively argument with a French journalist who started reciting to me all the English and American writers he had decided wrote badly. I couldn't guess his criterion until he mentioned that none of them wrote like Dickens. I told him there was no compulsion to do that. He was astonished. He explained at elegant, if laborious length, that in France there was really only one acceptable prose style, outside of the argot and vernacular of farm and city life. The style had been established in the 18th century, if not earlier. Molière wrote it, Flaubert wrote it, so did Victor Hugo, and so did President de Gaulle. I am happy to say that he was even more astonished when I told him that the beauty of English was its resilience, its great variety, the fact that he could embrace and rejoice in the styles of Dr. Johnson and Art Backward, of Chaucer and Henry James, of Dryden and H.L. Mencken, of John Milton and James Thurber, of Hemingway and S.J. Perelman, of Bernard Shaw and Peter de Vries, of Mark Twain and the King James Bible. You may say that you are not in the business of style. May I say that you are in the business of describing as precisely as possible what is happening to a man, woman, or child that seemed to be healthy and is now certainly sick. I truly believe that the best doctors are trying with all they have to practice and vindicate the scientific method, which I take to be the effort to find a generalization that covers all the known facts. There could be no nobler aim in science or in writing. You are in fact faced with the central problem of style, which is to say, as cogently as possible, what a given audience can understand. When it is brilliantly done in medicine, you have, by your own admission, the classic descriptions of disease. Burger, Osler, Freud on the central nervous system, a mere journalist, I am proud to say, Defoe on the signs and symptoms of the plague, and even though he was too young to have witnessed it. It is always a hard task, but I'd like to elaborate on the fact that it is not peculiar to medicine. When something is exactly analyzed and the definition is stripped to the bone, it is always memorable, which may be why centuries of students have memorized the propositions of Euclid. For when Euclid said, the angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are equal, it stays said. Very often the thing defined is something that's being noticed for generations but never said so well. Aristotle was the first man to notice that a play tends to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. This sentence guaranteed his immortality for over 2,000 years. I think one thing that holds good medical men back from the attempt to translate their jargon into Anglo-Saxon is the fear that they will lose their academic standing and become known as a popularizer, which among American scientists is a horrid word implying a degradation of truth in the interests of fat royalties, public popularity, or an invitation to appear on television. God knows we have as many of these fakers among doctors as we have among the hyperthyroid members of the clergy. But because something is done badly is no reason why it should not be done well. A Frenchman has told the history of the world more lucidly in 100 pages than Sandberg can tell the history of Abraham Lincoln in 4 verbose volumes. We are short, in an age of mass communications, pathetically short of good, let alone great, popularizers. I am sorry to have to say that I think the British have been, in our time and before our time, more concerned with the effort to reduce their professional longhand into the universal shorthand of the common speech. For classic examples, we need to go no further than one family and read T.H. Huxley on the habits of the ant or the butterfly and Julian Huxley on the biology of the penguin. I know that most of you had not the time to say in 200 words what the Journal of the American Medical Association managed to say in 2000. I respect the scruple of any professional man who refuses to fall into slap-happy generalizations for the sake of simplicity. Where it is a matter of life and death, or even of pain and discomfort, it is better to be accurate than lucid. But what I am saying is that given a simple fundamental change in medical education, rather a fundamental supplement in the early days, it could be possible for many doctors to be both lucid and accurate. Suppose that a first-rate teacher of the English language gave regular courses to medical students during their internship, or better, that there was always someone on hand to translate into English the parts and functions of the body at the moment a student was learning them, so that he discovers why finger bones are called phalanges, because he's reminded of the array of a Greek phalanx. And he learns also that lumbar is simply a loin. Then the day might even come when doctors would talk to patients about collarbones instead of clavicles, and admit to a scared patient that an oedema is nothing more or less than a swelling. If this happened, who, you may ask, would be the gainer? The answer is you and the patient and medicine, because the more you try to talk in sensible monosyllables, the more, I think, you'd find yourselves getting to the root of what was wrong and what was right. I certainly believe that if medical students were compelled to spend some time of every week translating passages from the Journal of the American Medical Association to English, they'd be surprised to discover how much of the professional jargon simply said the same thing over and over, or in a complicated way said nothing at all. How many of these learned men had the gift which Winston Churchill attributed to Ramsay MacDonald? Quote, the gift of compressing the smallest possible amount of thought into the greatest possible number of words. Of compressing the smallest possible amount of thought into the greatest possible number of words. I think if you try out these little translation experiments for yourselves, you will find that your work will be quickened by a directness and informed with a healing humanity for which none will be more grateful than the patients. And let us not get too solemn about what is meant by humanity. It ought always to mean compassion, but it might also include humor, which dignifies both the giver and the receiver, and is an excellent medicine in itself. Before I started a trip around the world, a doctor said to me that I ought, and I quote him, to equip yourself with appropriate cathartics, and also with some handy provision against dysentery. He was really not saying any more than a friend of mine, a layman, who only a few days later gave me the essential advice for all travellers in distant lands. You've got, he said, to load up with stoppers and starters. If I may say so, I am often struck, more often in America than anywhere else, with the contrast between the vivid and honest accuracy of the vernacular we all use and the often elephantine jargon of the specialist. Jargon, too, is often a cagey, non-committal attempt to walk all round the object. I mean this with all respect to anyone sweating to work his way through to fundamentals. When you really are unsure about a function or a process, you tend to get lost in a maze of protective adjectives and in many abstractions, which are the linguistic elements of cloudiness and fog. Soon the jargon, if repeated often enough, is doing the thinking for you. As a man who works at a bench with words, I sometimes look back over my daily pieces to try and spot words or expressions that I am using too often, for of course there is as much jargon in politics as in anything else. On the new frontier, nobody decided anything. They made a determination or judgment. Task forces were called on to prepare position papers until it was seen that a task force was no more than a committee trying to see where we all stood. In the great society, wars are no longer extended or spread, but escalated, causing the British cartoonist Osbert Lancaster to show a gentleman of the old school, hoping that since the Costa Brava is becoming so crowded in July, I hope the movement will not escalate to Frinton. I'm not saying you should drastically reform the journal. It's your playground and you should be allowed to have fun in it. I am not saying that you should not use ilium and tibia among yourselves. But the patient will probably feel more relieved to know that all he has is a pain in the pelvis or the shin bone. Of course, the impulse towards jargon is very much a matter of character, and it's likely that you can no more cure a naturally pompous person than you can reflower a virgin. So that you won't think I'm attributed indigenous pomp to the medical profession, let me give you some melancholy proof that the jargoneer appears in all walks of life. Road builders, you would think, would be more down to earth than other men. But in California, a low bridge is not marked as a low bridge. It is impaired vertical clearance. The gerontologists are in league with the real estate men to disguise, among other facts of life, the unavoidable one that we all grow old, so that an Englishman arriving in Phoenix, Arizona, and asking for the famous old folks' home is met by stony looks and directed to the senior citizens' retirement community. In the United Nations, there are no longer the rich and the poor, though the most menacing social fact of our time is that the rich countries are getting richer while the poor countries are getting poorer. But the poor will not be called poor. After a few years, they resented being called underdeveloped, so now they are known as developing. Shall we now take a look at your own beloved profession? Briefly, for it is a painful experience and this should be a joyous occasion. I am looking at a piece in a recent issue of your favorite journal about which jobs produce anxiety in the young. At one point, the author reveals the finding that occupation-related emotional stress may play a more significant role in the causation of coronary attacks in young persons than heredity. I take this to mean that the stresses of particular jobs may cause more heart attacks in the young than heredity. Next, the author says, to determine whether or not such a gradient in coronary heart disease prevalence does indeed exist, and this can be accurately translated as to find out whether this is so. What did he do? He, as he says, conducted a survey in selected types of employment which differ significantly with respect to tensions created by routine demands of the job. In other words, he decided to look into certain jobs that seemed to induce more or less tension in the young. He had his troubles, especially with the questionnaire. It is recognized, he says, that certain weaknesses are inherent in the questionnaire method of survey, chief of which is the unknown prevalence of disease among non-respondents. In other words, you can never know how sick are the absent. Finally, he produces this pearl. Moreover, this method does not provide data on deceased subjects. This great man has discovered not only that dead men tell no lies, they also answer no questions. Once, just before the construction of the floating harbours that were to be used for the invasion of Normandy, the Admiralty officials sent a note to the Prime Minister asking permission to start building at once. First, they explained the project, in elaborate language, and then wrote, quote, "Permission is urgently requested for the immediate implementation of this directive." Mr. Churchill sent the request back with a note in the margin. "If you mean should you build now, do it. Carry on." Ladies and gentlemen, do not equip yourselves with appropriate cathartics. Get some starters. Do not contrast living humanoids with deceased subjects. Study rather the quick and the dead. Do not implement a directive, ever. Just carry on. Okay, so this is Alistair Cooke and one of his lectures. Thank you for listening. I appreciate your comments, okay? I hope you didn't find it boring. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.